Good evening. Everybody hear me? I can turn this down. Yeah. Is that better? So I thought I would start tonight with a piece from my book. It's about my son, who I have 3 sons, and my oldest is now in his early 20s. But when he was about 4 or 5 was when this whole idea of talking about philosophy with kids began to sort of germinate in me. And so I thought I would start with him, fittingly, and with a little excerpt from the book. It's actually the beginning of the book, about a conversation that I had with him. When my oldest son, Will, was around 5, we loved to read Arnold Lobel's Frog and Toad stories together. One evening, we were reading the story The Dream from Frog and Toad together. In the story, Toad has a dream about starring in a play. And in his dream, his best friend, Frog, sits in the theater watching. As Toad performs, Frog starts shrinking until finally he can no longer be seen or heard. Toad screams for Frog and, waking up, finds Frog standing right by his bed. "Frog, is that really you?" Toad asks. Frog assures him that it is. Toad, utterly relieved, spends a, quote, "fine, long day," end quote, with Frog. Will and I began talking about dreams, about some of the dreams he'd had, and how real the dream in the story had felt to Toad. "Do you ever have dreams that feel so real that you wake up and for a little while you're not sure it was a dream?" I asked. "Yes," Will responded. "And then sometimes I wonder if I'm dreaming when I'm actually awake. I mean, could we be in a dream right now?" "What makes you ask that?" "Well, how do you know you're not?" "Do you think there are differences between the way dreams feel and being awake feels?" I asked him. "Dreams usually feel weird, like things happen in them that would never happen in real life." "But not always, right? You said that sometimes a dream feels so real you're not later sure it was a dream." "Yeah, so it could be that I'm dreaming right now." So when I was in graduate school doing my PhD in philosophy, as I say, Will was about 4 or 5, and he was starting to ask questions like this. What is fairness? Can you be sad and happy at the same time? Are thoughts real? And I recognized these questions as genuine philosophical questions. And this surprised me because I had never really thought of children as having philosophical potential. I guess if I had thought about it, I would have assumed they probably didn't have philosophical potential. And certainly in the academy, children's philosophical thinking wasn't a big topic of conversation in general. But I started remembering what I was like when I was like in elementary school, and that I would stay awake at night wondering about these kinds of questions and thinking about my place in the world and who I was and what was the meaning of my being alive. And so I started wondering if kids this age generally thought about such questions. So I talked Will's kindergarten teacher into letting me come in and do a philosophy class with his kindergarten peers. And I remember going to the classroom and I was so nervous. I had taught undergraduates, but I'd never taught kids. And the whole idea of it, I wasn't sure I knew what I knew I didn't know what I was doing. But I wanted to try it. It seemed like a really interesting possibility. And so I brought another Arnold Lobel story called Dragons and Giants, just a plug for Arnold Lobel. His stories are among the most philosophically suggestive of any children's books I know. They are among my favorites. They're wonderful stories. They're often early readers for kids, and they raise all kinds of interesting questions. So Dragons and Giants is a story where Frog and Toad decide they're going to figure out if they're brave or not. They read this book, and they start about someone who's brave, and they start wondering, are we brave? So they decide they're going to do some things that will make them see if they're brave, things that are kind of daunting for them. So they climb this mountain, and they're threatened by all kinds of things, and they end up racing back down the mountain, going into the house. One of them's hidden in the closet, the other one hides under the bed, and they talk to each other about how brave they feel. And it's a wonderful story for raising questions about bravery, questions like, can you be brave and afraid at the same time? Does bravery involve doing things that are daunting to you? And if it does involve doing things that are daunting, then can you be brave if you're not afraid? Do you have to have some fear involved to be brave? And the kindergarten students and I had a lovely discussion about these questions. So that kind of got me started. I've now been talking about philosophical questions with kids for over 15 years in all kinds of classrooms as well as with my own children. And I've come to see that children naturally have what I think of as the philosophical self. They have parts of them that wonder about their own experiences and the world, that question the meaning of the human condition, and that are really drawn to think about these deeper questions that underlie all of our experiences. All parents know the why questions children ask, right? Sometimes it drives you crazy. But these questions often do involve big, unsettled questions. Why do I dream? Why do I have thoughts? Why should I be fair? Etc. These questions are philosophical, but yet most people do not think that children are capable of philosophical thinking. Why? Well, I think there's kind of two reasons for that. The first is that philosophy is seen by many people as kind of an esoteric subject that belongs in the academy, that is really not accessible to most of us. And so we don't tend to see our musings, right? Why am I here? What's the meaning of life? What makes someone a friend? We don't tend to see those as belonging to the discipline of philosophy. But in fact, they do. And I've come to believe that philosophy should belong to all of us, that it does belong to all of us. And in fact, when I wrote the book, The Philosophical Child, my editor and I went back and forth about the title because she really thought I shouldn't use the word philosophical in it. She thought it was intimidating and it would turn people off, et cetera, and maybe it does. But I felt like I really wanted to reclaim this title. I wanted to reclaim this word for children because I think it is authentically what children do. And I feel like it's important to call it that and to have them join what is a centuries-old tradition in which they should be a part. So the second reason that I think that we often don't put children and philosophy together or think of children as capable of philosophical reflection is that in general, I think we underestimate children. And in no area is that truer than in their capacities for deep and sustained reflection about the world into which they've been born. As a result, we easily miss children's philosophical musings because we fail to notice the profoundly serious questions that often underlie their remarks. We just don't hear them because we already assume that philosophy is too difficult or too abstract and that children are incapable of appreciating philosophical issues. So when they do make these remarks or ask these questions, they're often treated dismissively or condescendingly. How often do adults, and there's several of these kinds of adults in my family, remark on a reflective or provocative comment made by a child by pointing out how adorable or amusing it is? Meanwhile, a similar remark made by an adult will elicit a much more thoughtful response. But now, I've probably had hundreds of conversations with children, and it's clear to me that children are indeed capable of philosophical thinking, and moreover, quite drawn to it. That for many, if not most children, reflection about who they are, why they're here, the sort of ordinary concepts that make up their world is deeply important to them. I have had so many young children say to me over the years, I think about these questions all the time. I'm so happy to talk about them. I had a class today with a group of second graders, so these are 7-year-olds, and we had this conversation about making mistakes. What is a mistake? Should you try to be perfect? Is perfection possible? What would it mean for a human being to be perfect? And a second grader, towards the end of the conversation, said, well, it seems like if you were someone who never made mistakes, then you wouldn't really be a person. There would be something about you that would be very different from from how people are, and I would think that would make you really lonely. So I thought that was a wonderful comment and very profoundly insightful about both the concept and about the way people are. Another example, I'll read you one more example from my book. This is a conversation with my middle son. When he was probably about 8, we were reading a book about numbers, and he commented to me that he thought numbers were beautiful. What makes you say numbers are beautiful? I replied to David. They're just so perfect, he commented. All the patterns, kind of like puzzles. I don't know with number 1, there's just 1 of everything. But then you go to 2, and there's 2 of everything. So everything doubles, and the whole thing changes completely. And then it happens again when you get to 4. It's one of those things that seems simple, but the more you think about it, the more interesting it is, isn't it? I responded. Exactly. I love looking at these pictures and thinking about the numbers. So do you think numbers can be like art in a way? I asked. I think so, I guess. I mean, what makes something art? Well, is the book art? Yes. David paused. Maybe. The pictures are beautiful. So is being beautiful what makes something art then? I'm not sure. I mean, I think there are beautiful things that aren't art. Like what? I asked. Like flowers and trees. Why can't flowers and trees be art? I think art has to be made by a person, David replied. It just can't be already in the world. But numbers aren't made by people, so can they be art? Maybe not. But they can be beautiful, so maybe something can be beautiful and not be art. But can it be art and not be beautiful, I wondered. I'm not sure about that one, Mom. But probably yes. I mean, I don't think rap is beautiful exactly, but I'd say it's art. So I think that these kinds of conversations help children to cultivate their philosophical selves, help them cultivate the part of them that thinks about these deeper questions and that can recognize them when they arise. Why do I think it's important? There's kind of 3 different kinds of reasons, I think, for that. And the first is that I believe that wondering about our experiences and the mysteries of life is at the core of what it means to be a human being. Our ability to be aware of our own experiences, to reflect about them, makes us, I think, who we are. And nurturing this part of us can give children's lives greater depth and meaning and help them to develop a kind of a critical consciousness about the way things are. Not to accept the way things might seem at first glance, but to really start to be more critical and to look more deeply at the things with which they're faced in their lives. When we try to answer all our children's questions, we fail to make a space for them to question and examine their own experiences and ideas. And I think that that's really a loss for them, because finding your own voice and learning that your own thoughts about your experiences and the way the world works are as valuable and can contribute something to an ongoing dialogue is a very empowering experience, I believe, for kids. The second reason that I think doing philosophy with kids is an important thing to do is because, by definition, questions of philosophy don't have one settled answer. When you engage in a philosophical conversation, you start to understand that there are many ways to see the same thing. I've had teachers tell me for years that one of the things that happens in classrooms after I've been there for a while is that students, even pretty young students, first graders, second graders, will start to say things to each other like, well, that's your point of view, but there are other ways to see it, as opposed to you're wrong, which is often what happens. And I think that this experience of understanding that there are many ways to see the same thing, many perspectives, and all of them unique, valuable, and even necessary, is a powerful one, especially in this time in human history, where greater and greater presumed certainty about values and ideas lead people to extreme acts of violence and oppression. So it's imperative that our children understand that there are a multitude of ways to understand the world, and that elemental questions about human life remain unresolved. The third piece of doing philosophy with children, of helping them to cultivate their philosophical selves, is that I believe that philosophy is probably the best discipline for cultivating analytic, reasoning, and critical thinking capacities. Because philosophy focuses on the assumptions that underlie our thinking and involves questions that aren't settled in a final way, it teaches us to evaluate claims based on reason and analysis, rather than on fixed beliefs and prejudice. And for our children especially, it's going to be crucial for them to learn how to evaluate the multitude of information that comes at them in contemporary life, much of which is presented to them as fact or as true, and particularly online. I work with teenagers who will say to me, well, I read it online, so it must be true. And then we have the conversation, well, so what does it mean for something to be true? And how do you know something? And if it's written online, why does that make it true, as opposed to finding it on a piece of paper on the street? Why is it seeing it on the computer give it some more authority, etc.? talking with children about these kinds of questions cultivates what I have started to call philosophical sensitivity. It's kind of a new way of seeing the world. It's sort of like someone who develops an artistic sensibility, right? So they do lots of work learning about, say, visual arts, and you go to a museum with them, and they see all kinds of features in the paintings, all kinds of relationships between the paintings that you miss because you haven't been so educated. Or you take a walk in the woods with a naturalist, and that person sees a web of interrelationships, sees a host of changes and relationships between things that you also just don't see. So similarly, I think philosophical sensitivity is a way of seeing the deeper facets of questions, beliefs, and situations that might otherwise elude us. The conception actually comes out of an idea that Aristotle came up with. He thought that we have certain perceptual capacities, ways of perceiving the world that can be developed with training and education. For him, this was related to moral perception, the ability to understand easily what matters in a moral decision. But I think similarly, there's something going on where as you start to cultivate thinking about these philosophical topics, you are able to recognize and reflect about what are sometimes called existential questions related to life, death, and reality, etc., as well as other philosophical issues like knowledge, ethics, art and beauty, justice and freedom, etc. So the way the world appears to us starts to change, and we start to perceive more readily the often hidden layers of meaning that are there, but we can miss them if we don't look for them. And I think helping kids to do that is an important thing. So how do you do this? What do you do? The reason I actually wrote the book is I've been writing a blog for almost 5 years about doing philosophy with kids, and I write some about my own kids and our conversations, and also conversations I have with kids in classrooms, and about books that raise certain philosophical questions, etc. And I've had many parents, grandparents, teachers, and others write to me and say, how do I do this with my own family or my own kids or the children in my life? And so that's what really motivated me to write the book. I think that often adults are shy away from these kinds of conversations with children. And part of it is that in our relationships with children, we often play the role of the expert, the advisor, right? We can teach children how to tie their shoes, how to tell time, explain to them kind of the rules of the classroom, how they should treat their siblings, etc. But when we start talking about questions like what is beauty or what is friendship, we don't have the answers, right? We can't really be the repositories of wisdom because we're not able to give them settled answers, and shouldn't, right? Because these questions don't have settled answers. And so our role shifts. Instead of being like an advisor or an expert, we become what I think of as a co-inquirer. We're seeking with children to better understand this dimension of experience. And so in these exchanges, we're much more equal. We're both bringing something important to the enterprise. As adults, we're bringing greater conceptual sophistication, more life experience, but children are bringing a fresh perspective and openness to exploring all possible views. What adults might sometimes characterize as children's naivete becomes a strength because they're unafraid about looking at a question imaginatively. They don't worry as much about making a mistake or sounding silly or not sounding smart enough or whatever. And they share their thoughts with relative unreservedness. A philosopher, Gary Matthews, once said that this allows for what he called the free exploration of possibilities. And I think that's right. I think this, when you do this with children, there's sort of a creative collaboration that starts to emerge. And it's a very different aspect to your relationship than the ordinary parent-child, no, you can't stay out till 11 p.m., whatever. I have found with my own children that engaging in philosophical conversations over the years has, I think, really made our relationship a different one than it would have been otherwise. And I think that what's happened is that there's now an ease of communication between us that reflects the fact that I've been attentive to their questions, that they know that asking questions is a really good thing. It's an important thing. It doesn't just mean there's something you should know that you don't. It means that there's something interesting to puzzle about, and that when they have a question, it means there is something interesting to puzzle about, right? They trust their own sense of that. And in engaging in this sort of philosophical dialogues together, we respect each other's autonomy and points of view, and they have developed a lot of confidence in their own abilities to evaluate problems. Now, sometimes that can be challenging with teenagers in particular, where, my children will say to me, well, what is a child, Mom? I'm 17. Why can't I do what you do? At what point do, et cetera? And there are times where we'll engage in those conversations, and there are times where I'll say, that's very interesting, you still can't, take my car and go whatever, So we're not in this mode all the time, but I think it does create a sort of a lightness about the way we engage with each other, because there is a lot of trust. And I do think that a lot of that has come from these kinds of conversations happening all the time over the years. So what are some strategies for engaging with children in thinking about philosophical questions? How do you identify when a child might be seeking a philosophical exchange? First, instead of reacting to a child's question with an answer or advice, pause and reflect a little. What is the child asking? It's because it's the child's questions that should spur the philosophical conversation, right? The idea isn't to enlighten the child with your thoughts about, say, free will or whatever, but to invite them to share the questions that intrigue them, and then to allow the conversation to flow from that. Because when I facilitate a philosophy session in a classroom, for example, I'll usually bring a story or something, but I don't really have any idea where it's going to go. I might think we're going to end up talking about free will, but we might end up talking about the nature of beauty or something completely different, because I want the questions to emerge from what interests the children. So listen for questions that invite deeper inquiry, like, are numbers real? And then respond not by trying to answer it, but by asking the child what prompted the question. So say the child says, well, I was just thinking about numbers. You can't see or touch them, but are they real? Think about the question yourself. You might respond with something like, why do you think we have numbers? Or what do you think it means for something to be real? You can ask things like, if what you just said is true, does that mean whatever, right? So, for example, I had a conversation with a group of fourth grade students at Whittier Elementary earlier this week, and the topic was, does everything have a right to life? And most of the children wanted to say, yes, everything has a right to life, and many of them wanted to say, not only that, everything has an equal right to life. Oh, okay. I said, so does that mean when I swat a mosquito and kill it, or exterminate a hornet's nest, am I doing something wrong? And it led to a really interesting discussion about your perspective and whether that determines whether you're doing something wrong. In other words, do humans have a human-centered perspective? One kid said, well, if we lived in a world with giant mosquitoes, the mosquitoes might think about us the way we think about mosquitoes, right? And we talked about how you measure, is one life more valuable than another, and if so, how do you make those kinds of determinations, et cetera. So one of the best resources for engaging in philosophical conversations with children is children's books. I think my happiest discovery, or certainly one of them as a parent, was the discovery that many children's stories are deeply philosophical. Apparently, children's authors are aware of children's philosophical propensities in the way many adults are not. So I thought I would talk a little bit just about some of my favorite picture books and give you a sense of how you might use such books to talk with kids about philosophical questions. In the book, there is at the end of the book a whole list of philosophically suggestive children's books, picture books, early chapter books, middle school books, books for teens, etc. So one book that I love, that's a classic story, is The Velveteen Rabbit, which I'm assuming most of you know. So this is a wonderful story for talking about metaphysical questions with kids. So this is another thing about philosophy, right? Philosophers love this really difficult terminology. So we use words like metaphysics and epistemology so that everyone kind of goes, this is like I don't know what they're talking about, right? But all metaphysics is questions about the nature of reality. And all epistemology is questions about knowledge. So and I like to talk with kids about metaphysics and epistemology because I want them to have that terminology. So The Velveteen Rabbit, as I'm sure most or all of you know, is a story about a little stuffed rabbit who's trying to decide what it means to be real. And one of his friends tells him that you become real when someone loves you. And so eventually the boy with whom he lives loves him, and he becomes real. But then he meets some rabbits who can move around on their own in a way he can't. And they make fun of him and make him think that he's not as real as they are. This is all sort of, it's really, I think, in many ways based on Plato's idea of levels of reality. And I've had really interesting discussions with children about, if something's real, can something be more real than something that's already real? Is there such a thing as something being real but not as real as something else, etc.? And then, of course, do you have to perceive something for it to be real? Do you have to see or touch or smell it for it to be real? Is happiness real? Is love real? Etc. Another book that is actually a new discovery for me, but I'll put in a plug for it, is called Infinity and Me. And it's a book in which a young 8-year-old girl is out looking at the stars one night, and she's wondering how many stars are in the sky. Maybe the number is as big as infinity. And then she starts to feel really small, she says. How could I even think about something as big as infinity? So she starts to go around and talk to the people she knows, her parents, her teachers, her friends, and ask them, how do you think of infinity? She imagines and then she figures out that when everyone talks about infinity, they always talk about it as involving forever. So she starts thinking about this concept of forever. And she thinks about, what would I want to do forever? She imagines having recess forever. And then she says, but if there's no school before recess and no school after recess, is it really recess, right? So the story is a really nice one for provoking conversations about, obviously, infinity and what is eternity or forever, but also about time and space and numbers and friendship and love, etc. Another favorite of mine, and this I'll put in a plug for this author as well, is Dr. Seuss. Sorry. And Horton Hears a Who, which I assume most of you also know, is a great story for talking about how we know what we know. So in this story, Horton finds a dust speck. He is sure that there is somebody on that who needs help. He thinks he hears them, but nobody else hears them, and everyone starts making fun of him, and they try, they're harassing him, and he is sure that he's right. And so and eventually it turns out he is right. There's not only a person, but there's a whole world of people, basically a whole city of people living on this dust speck. And so it raises the question, did he know this? And if so, how did he know it? And if he didn't know it, but he just believed it, what's the difference between knowing it and believing it? And why didn't other people believe it, etc.? The Harry Potter books are other books that are wonderful for raising questions about knowledge and belief. For example, in the first Harry Potter, there's a chapter of it, that's called the Mirror of Erised, where Harry finds this mirror, which basically, we're told, shows you your deepest desires. So Harry, who's an orphan, looks in the mirror and he sees himself surrounded by his family. And so he becomes kind of obsessed with this, right? He keeps going back night after night to look at it because it makes him feel like he is connected to this family, an experience that he has never had. And then the headmaster finds him and says to him, I'm going to put this mirror somewhere else. I don't want you to look for it. This isn't a good thing because it can, he says, give you neither knowledge nor truth. So what does this mean? Does he mean that the mirror only gives Harry appearances of his parents and not real people, and images can't give us knowledge? But don't we sometimes get knowledge from appearances, like dreams, etc.? Another area that's really interesting to talk about with children is ethics. What makes an action right or wrong? What's a good life? What's the nature of happiness, friendship? Is happiness important? Should we be tolerant? What is honesty, etc.? One book that has been a really fruitful one for these kinds of discussions is a book called The Three Questions by Jana Mohr, and in it he takes Tolstoy's story, The Three Questions, which is about trying to find the answer to the three important questions: what should I be doing? What's the right thing to do? Who should I be with? I think I got that not quite right, but sort of like that. And I often will read it and ask children, so what do you think are the most important questions? And often the questions are related to ethics. What's a good life? What should I be doing with my life? Who am I supposed to be, etc. And then finally, I like to talk about aesthetics with children. And by aesthetics, I mean questions not only about art, but also about beauty and about the experience of beauty, right? So not just looking at paintings or painting or making music or listening to music, but also the way a good meal feels, or looking at a sunset, or other kinds of experiences that we might characterize as giving us a sense of something that's beautiful or sublime. And one thing I do with children that I've did with my own children and have done it with lots of other children is to ask them to do two drawings. And one has to be something that they would say is art, that they would bring home and tell their parents, look at the art I made today. And the other is one that they would say, this is not art. And it's always really a fascinating experience, because it's actually really hard to create something that's not art, right? Because someone might look at it and say, and typically this is what will happen, either siblings or me or classmates will say, but wait a minute, that has really nice color. It may be all scribbled, but there's something interesting about it, right? I'll sometimes, have a blank sheet of paper and I'll say, okay, this is my art. And that, and they're like, well, how is that art? Well, what about if I lifted it up and I said, this is my art and it's called silence? Does that change anything? Well, maybe, right? Or maybe if you were a famous artist, we might consider that might be art, right? I'm not sure we're convinced otherwise, but it raises the nice questions, right? What makes something art? Does somebody have to like it to be art? Do a lot of people have to like it to be art? Does anybody have to like it for it to be art, etc.? There's a book called Ish, which talks about a young boy who is drawn to making art. He does all kinds of drawings, and then his brother one day looks at his drawing and basically makes fun of it, says like, what is that? And the boy is crushed, and he decides, then he starts like drawing, and he wants everything to be perfect, and he gets completely frustrated, and he takes his last drawing and he throws it away, and he says, I'm done, I'm not doing this anymore. And his sister picks up the drawing, and she runs into her room, and he runs after her, and he gets in her room, and all around her room are all his discarded drawings that she's flattened and hung up. And he looks around, and he's dumbfounded. And he looks at one and he says, oh, and she says, that's my favorite. And he says, yeah, that was supposed to be a vase. And she says, well, it's vase-ish. And then he realizes, like, it doesn't have to be the way everyone else sees it. Art for him is all about expressing the way he sees it. So he decides to live his life in, the author tells us, an ishful way. And so I've had wonderful conversations with children about, what does that mean? What does living life ishfully mean? And it's interesting because some children will say, well, basically, they don't use these words, but basically they say, sounds like a cop-out to me. Like, ishful means you don't have to try very hard. And other children will say, well, wait a minute, I don't think that's right. I mean, maybe that can be true. Maybe someone could use it as an excuse. But I remember a child said, but couldn't it also mean that you just like sort of enjoy what happens in your life without having to like be in charge of all of it, So, and finally, I'll talk about one more story and then I'll take questions because this is a classic story, and that's The Ugly Duckling, which is a wonderful story for raising questions, and particularly about beauty. And I think it's really important to talk with children about what makes something beautiful and what beauty is, because we live in a culture that idolizes a very narrow form of physical beauty, especially for girls. And so to talk with them about what really makes something beautiful. Is it just someone's physical appearance? I mean, I've never had this conversation with children that it hasn't emerged in the group that isn't what it's about. I mean, we'll ask the question, so can you be a terrible person and be beautiful? And typically the children will go back and forth about it, but at least it will emerge, well, only in a very narrow way, right? I mean, maybe in some small sense you might be, but beauty has to encompass more than that. And I think and so the ugly duckling is a wonderful story, because what makes the ugly duckling ugly, right? Well, it's the view of everybody else. And then what makes the ugly duckling beautiful at the end, similarly. And if you're beautiful, can you have ever been ugly? Can you be ugly and beautiful at the same time? Once you're ugly, are you always ugly, etc.? So that's also a wonderful story, as are many fairy tales, for talking about these kinds of questions with children. Okay, well, I will stop here, and I'm happy to take questions from the audience.
Hello. Hi, thanks for coming out to talk to us tonight. I was wondering, is there any process for requesting you to come into a certain school or class to initiate some of these discussions?
Yeah, basically you should just find us on the Northwest Center for Philosophy for Children has a website, and it has an email, and you should just email us. And if you're in the Seattle area, we try to accommodate, at least coming in and doing some demonstration classes, talking with the teachers, that kind of thing.
Okay.
So,
cool.
Yeah.
Great, thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I noticed that the focus is largely on the positive aspects of philosophical discussions and explanations leading to discussions. How would you approach some of our current philosophical positions that are in fact pernicious and destructive? And how can you get across to the kids that ultimately you can think whatever you want, but your actions are limited by the society around you?
Okay, let's see. Where do I start with that one? So I guess I would start, and I'm going to try and get to, because there's several pieces in that question. I would start by saying that I have a lot of faith in children, and I think that helping them to think carefully about questions gives them skills and confidence to then be able to tackle the difficult issues and problems that await them. So and it's not all, positive and light and laughter, right? I mean, sometimes we talk about questions that are difficult questions. We talk about questions about death, about loss, etc., right? So, and I think that thinking about those questions, and not just thinking about them themselves, but thinking about them with me and with their peers, siblings, family members, classmates, really helps them both to make a deeper connection with each other and understand that some of the things that they ponder and puzzle about are shared. And I think that experience can then help them to deal with the as you say, some of the more pernicious belief systems or values that they're going to face in the larger world. In terms of the limits of the society, so I'm not sure exactly what you mean by that. I mean, I do think, of course, we live in a world, there are limits to what you can do, but I guess maybe I don't think there are as many as you might think there are. So I'm curious about what you mean exactly.
Two examples. One real simple, of course, would be, yes, you have to go to school. And another one that's probably more difficult to deal with is you can be opposed to abortions, but you can't kill abortion doctors.
Okay. I'll start with the first one. Is that okay?
Okay.
So the school one's a really good one, because I have several things I use to talk about why should we go to school, and that question will come up often in various readings. Why should we go to school? And I think that's an example of, I have a lot of views about that question, but I think that it's an example of listening to children's thoughts about that, right? Because first of all, I think children think a lot about why they should go to school, because for most of them, they have to go to school. They have to be there. It's not their choice, right? So they think a lot about why they're there, whether they want to be there, etc. And most of the conversations I've had are pretty thoughtful about it. And most of them give me, and I think others, ideas for how to make schools places that more children would want to be, right? Because their thoughts about what makes school positive and what makes school maybe less appealing are actually often quite discerning and quite interesting, right? And so that I feel like that's helpful. And it's empowering for them to think about this question. I mean, we all have things we have to do, right, in our lives. I mean, there are lots of times that I don't want to cook dinner for my family or whatever, right? But asking a child, so why is this important? Do you think it's important? Right, and like I say, I mean, with my own children, so that we had lots of conversations over the years about various issues, you know, about childhood and justice and freedom, and that didn't mean that I wasn't still the parent, that my sons weren't still the children, and I still wasn't able to say to them, you know, yes, you have to go to school. On things like abortion, I think that one of the things we want our children to feel is that they're engaged in the world in which they live. And being engaged in the world in which you live, as in a philosophy discussion or anything else, sometimes things go your way and sometimes they don't, right? So you have a point of view, and maybe most of the people around you don't share that point of view. So one of the things you learn, I think, in talking about philosophy is you could have a very valuable, important thing to say, and no one agrees with you. And that's okay, right? It still matters to you. And so you might hold a very strong opinion about, say, abortion and not like the current political situation, but at least you're able to think through why you think about it the way you do, what makes sense to you, what you can do to make things better, given your perspective, et cetera.
Can I just, sorry. So the point is not to tell them, but to ask them. And the whole discussion is for them to take a look outside and see what effect they're having on the world and the effect that the world is having on them, so they don't live in like a philosophical isolation.
Right. Oh, absolutely. No. And I mean, and again, I mean, I think that philosophy has a really bad name, you know? I mean, I think that it's impossible to live in philosophical isolation, because philosophy is all about connecting with your intellectual heritage, with other people's thoughts about various topics, right? So the more you think about these questions, the more you should be widening your views, right? Widening your sphere of what's possible rather than narrowing it. Yeah. Other questions?
So I wonder, do you think that philosophy can be used in any way to prevent bullying in school, or to even fix a class that has terrible bullying problems? Can the debates of philosophy maybe fix that, and how, if so?
So, you know, fixing it is a tall order, right? So I don't want to make claims that are overstated. But so for a number of years, I've taught a class in 8th grade called Moral Philosophy and Genocide. And what we do in this class is we watch films that raise questions about indifference, being a bystander, etc. And always, and we watch Hotel Rwanda, and we talk about the Holocaust, etc. And always what comes up is bullying, right? Being in the hallway, seeing something you're uncomfortable with, and because most kids are not bullying, right? Most kids have bullied and have been bullied, but most kids generally don't make a habit of either, right? So most kids are bystanders, like most people. And so helping them to think about what, you know, is being a bystander wrong, right? Is indifference wrong? If you're a bystander, are you always indifferent? And helping them talk about these questions with each other, I think, does alleviate some of what can go on in the hallway. Will it, you know, fix it? I think I don't know that one solution is going to fix the perennial middle school bullying problem, but I do think that helping students to engage with each other about these questions and to really listen to each other. Because part of what happens in philosophy is it's all about listening to what everyone else has to say. I always say to kids and to young people, the thing about a philosophical discussion is it can't be about waiting till you can raise your hand and say what you want to say, right? Because what will happen if you listen to each other is all your views will start to expand. You'll start to see things and think about things differently. You might still have some very strong views and principles that remain your own that you hold on to, but you'll start to think about them differently. You'll start to be able to defend them more effectively because you'll see how other people think. And so there is a really strong element to philosophical discussion that involves deep listening in a way that I think is not characteristic of much of the exchanges that go on between people.
But I was also thinking in relation to what you said earlier about beauty and different aspects of that and respecting others, especially here in America, as you say, where this very narrow definition of beauty leads to a lot of bullying, or even maybe just indirect bullying as women or young girls criticizing themselves without even the others doing it. And I don't know how it is here in school, but I hear in Denmark, where I'm from, that even teenage boys call teenage girls in their own class hoes and terrible things, and that's just the way they talk, and the teachers are appalled, and they don't know what to do about it. Right.
And I do think that, structured dialogues where students are expressing themselves in what ends up being a very personal way, because when you're talking about questions like, who am I? What is the self? What's the meaning of life, etc.? Who you are starts to emerge. It's not just an abstract intellectual enterprise, right? It really becomes very personal, and that I think can change the tenor of a classroom. And I've had multiple anecdotal reports from teachers about how indeed that's what happens in a classroom, that children start to listen to each other in a different way and to get to know each other in a different way, right? Because it's often the silent, somewhat checked out students who really get engaged in philosophy classes. It's interesting how that happens. I had a teacher tell me today, actually, some of the students really surprised me, the ones who speak out. This is in a 4th grade class, because they don't speak at all otherwise in class. So so I think it is a powerful thing for many kids.
That's good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Hello.
Do you find students who are raised in strictly religious homes more inhibited about engaging in philosophical discussion for fear of implicit parental disapproval? Do you find that to be true? And if you do, how do you help those students engage in rigorous, honest philosophical discussion that even might threaten their sense of religious absolutes?
So the short answer is no. I actually don't find, in my experience, that children raised in very strong religious homes are less inclined to speak out about philosophical questions or to think critically about them. There are a couple of subjects that tend to bring up these issues, like why is there something rather than nothing? So that conversation, which I've had with many kids over the years, typically that will come up and a child will say, well, there's something because God created the world, right? And then often, and it won't come from me, often another child will say, well, but then doesn't that raise the same question, like, who created God? And so then a child might say, well, God's always existed, which of course is not any different than saying, well, the universe has always existed, right? So we've been able to have these conversations without impinging on children's religious convictions. I haven't found, it's interesting, I hear from my undergraduate students, we do these philosophy for children classes, and I hear from my undergraduate students, many times they'll tell me, I was raised in a very religious home. I wish I had had this because it took me so long to start to think, and some of them are still religious and some of them are not, but they felt like they needed something to help them question. I mean, my own view is if your religious convictions are sound, then you shouldn't worry about questioning them, right? Because they'll hold up. And I think, I mean, so I hope that answers your question. Okay.
Hello.
Hi.
What kinds of activities or games would you recommend a child to do which helps them, encourages them towards a philosophical outlook on life?
Games or
Sure.
activities.
Yeah.
Well, I think there's all I mean, if you're talking about like how do you get children to move around
Right.
when you're doing this? I mean, I have 3 boys, so I know all about that. I think one of the things that I did with my kids and that I've done in a classroom is like if we're having a conversation about something, we'll like move to different sides of the room depending on what we think about it, you know? So in other words, if you think like, just as an example, that bravery always involves fear, you stand over there. You know, if you think it never does, you stand over here or somewhere in between. And then we'll talk about it. And as we're talking about it, if we change our views, we like move around the room, you know. So that's one thing. There are lots of activities on our website, like they're not physical games, but games and activities that you can use to raise questions like, is life fair? We have a game where you kind of pretend to be, that my colleague David Shapiro created, where you are given an identity, basically. It comes out of John Rawls's work. And then you have to and then you decide about how to apportion various goods and bad things in the world, right? And then your identity is taken away and you know you're going to have a new one, but you don't know what it's going to be. So you sort of have to figure out from this position of not knowing where in the society you're going to land, what's going to be fair. And there's many of them on the website. In terms of, I think you can create a philosophical exchange with anything, right? So if you're playing baseball, you can start to talk about the rules of baseball, right? So why are the rules of baseball the rules of baseball? Would it be baseball if it didn't have these rules, right? What if we changed X or Y? Would it still be baseball? I mean, you can talk about anything, right, in a way that raises these sort of larger questions about what makes something what it is, or that questions the concepts.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I don't know if that fully answers your question or not. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Does the Seattle Public Schools and/or any other public schools in Washington State now or ever pay you money to do this, or how do you, or just go to like Catholic schools or what?
Nope. We are almost exclusively in public schools. Mostly because of our commitment, and we really are in a lot of schools, or have been over the years in a lot of schools where children are less likely to get this kind of enrichment than others. So we are very much committed to being in the Seattle Public Schools. And actually, I think one of the reasons our program is been successful and that schools really like it is it doesn't cost the schools anything. Our program is run through the University of Washington funding, as well as funding from various grants, and we have a number of donors who donate every year to the program, and that's what keeps it running. So we are able to offer this to the Seattle Public Schools without them having to pay for it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Please join me in thanking Jana Mohr Lone.